All right, y'all. So, welcome back to the problem with, and we're on our the myths and the lies we tell section of our show. It is a Monday a part of the show, and I am thankful so far for everybody who so far subscribed to the Spotify podcast on YouTube, Apple. Thank you so much for that, and I appreciate you guys are spreading the word for this, and I appreciate your comments to this because I know I might say something that you agree and disagree, and that's the point of this, to create some discussion. And that's the point of this is also to push the idea, not an idea, the truth of what's going on in our country. You might disagree, but at the same time, it's the reality of what is going on. So with that, I want to jump into today's episode. In today's episode, it's something that maybe you have heard thousands of times and you agree with me, or maybe you have no idea of why it's going on, or maybe you need that cranky uncle to be able to hear this. So let's start with today's episode. The lie that there's this rebranding treason as tradition. So what I mean by that is you probably have heard the Southern Pride myth. So if you have heard this, is that how we have like the Southern states believe that they're Southern Pride and they have to wave the Confederate flag. So let's start with that. Like when we start, let's get one thing straight before we dive into this. You don't get to wave the Confederate flag and call yourself a patriot. You don't get to idolize men who kill American soldiers and claim you support the troops. And you sure as hell don't get to chant Southern Pride when you're really proud is the legacy soaked in racism, violence, and treason. Because that's what the Confederacy was. Treason. It was a violent rebellion against the United States, and it was not to protect liberty, not to defend freedom, but to uphold the enslavement of black people as a cornerstone of society. A betrayal wrapped in the language of honor and tradition. And it was sold to future generations as something novel. And somehow, here we are in 2025, still arguing about this, still watching Confederate flags fly at rallies, still seeing monuments to slaveholders defending like national treasures, still hearing the tired excuse that is just about heritage. And now Donald Trump, the king of manufactured victimhood, is once again promising to rename the U.S. military bases that had finally been stripped of Confederate names. Names like Fort Bragg, which was honoring Braxton Bragg, a Confederate general who was so incompetent he lost nearly every battle he commanded and was despised by his own troops. And he wasn't honored for brilliance. He was honored because he fought to keep human beings in chains. Let's talk the facts. In 2021, Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act with bipartisan support, Republican, Democrat, to remove Confederate names from U.S. military bases. The Pentagon itself supported this. This wasn't some liberal cancel culture stunt. It was the military saying, we don't honor traitors. It was about finally aligning our public symbols with our supposed values. But Trump wants to undo all of that again. He's running again not running. He's pressing on a platform that glorifies the Confederacy, that paints this base renaming as an attack on the South, and that fuels the false idea that remembering slavery truthfully is somehow un-American. Let's be clear. This episode isn't just about the one base name or the one flag or one speech. This is about the long-running myth of the quote-unquote Southern Pride. The lie that the Confederacy was about honor. The lie that the Civil War was just a disagreement between gentlemen. The lie that slavery was a quote-unquote necessary evil, or that it wasn't the root cause of secession. This myth has been carefully curated for over 150 years, in textbooks, in movies, in museums, in classrooms, and now in campaign rallies. It is a lie that replaces truth with nostalgia, that sanitizes horror, that equates regional identity with violent supremacy. Because let's be honest, if the Confederacy had won, this country would have split into a slave empire and a democratic republic. And that's not a hypothetical. That was the plan. And yet, we still let people act like this is a debate. But it's not a debate, it's a reckoning. And so today, we're going going to what too many history classes, too many leaders, too many media outlets still refuse to do. We are telling the truth. We're ripping the curtain off the lies of the Southern pride and exposing it for what it really is. A rebranded defense of slavery built on the bones of a failed rebellion and preserved through propaganda. Because when your pride is built on bondage, when your tradition is born from treason, when your flag is soaked in the blood of human trafficking and civil war, that's not heritage, that's hate, and it's time we said it out loud.
The Lost Cause was a national propaganda campaign to misrepresent what the Civil War was actually about. The main tenets of the Lost Cause are that the Confederacy was fighting for states' rights, not slavery, that slaves had great working conditions, were loyal to their masters, and often fought for the Confederacy, portraying slave owners as kind and Southerners in general as more steeped in Christian values in order to make the case that they were fighting for a just cause and only lost because they were outnumbered.
Let's start with the number one excuse you hear from the Confederate apologists. The Civil War wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights. All right, let's ask the only question that actually matters here. The right to do what? Because the South wasn't fighting for the right to farm. They weren't fighting over railroad routes or tariffs or infrastructure bills. They went to war for the right to own people. To buy them, to sell them, to rape, beat, breed, and kill them as property. They were terrified that Lincoln's election will eventually challenge that power. Not immediately. Lincoln didn't even call for abolition at first, but they saw the writing on the wall. And the truth? They didn't whisper about it. They screamed it. Let's go get the receipts. Let's start with the cornerstone speech. Alexander H. Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy, laid it out on his cornerstone speech of 1861. And I quote, "Our government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea of, quote unquote, of equality. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the," I'm going to say the word, "is not equal to the white man. That slavery is his natural and normal condition." That's not French statement. That was the Vice President of the Confederacy explaining in plain English what they were fighting for. Then every single Confederate state that issued a Declaration of Secession explicitly mentioned slavery, not tariffs and not federal outreach. Let's read a few excerpts. Mississippi. "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." Georgia. "The prohibition of slavery in the territories is the cardinal principle of this organization." Texas. "We hold as undeniable truths that the government of the northern states have proclaimed the debasing doctrine of the equality of all men, irrespective of race or color." South Carolina. "A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of president upon the basis of hostility to slavery." They didn't say states' rights to self-govern. They say, we're leaving because you're threatening our ability to enslave. And that's the truth. And that's the part of many modern defenders want to erase. Because if they admit it was about slavery, they have to confront the reality that their ancestors fought not for freedom, but for the right to deny it to others. So where did the states' rights myth come from? This lie didn't start during the Civil War. It started way after. In the years following defeat, the South didn't just rebuild its cities, it rebuilt its story. The myth of the quote-unquote lost cause emerged. It was a propaganda campaign led by the Confederate veterans, Southern politicians, and a group like the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They rewrote history to make the war sound noble, not monstrous. And they published textbooks, erected monuments, and filled cemeteries with language like honor, valor, and heritage. They claimed the war was about state sovereignty and Southern way of life. They pushed this narrative that generations of Americans grew up believing it. But here's what that way of life actually was. A plantation economy built entirely on stolen labor and enforced by violence. And that, state sovereignty? It only mattered when it protected slavery. Because the same Confederates who screamed states' rights were also the same people who supported things like the Fugitive Slave Act, which forced northern states to return escaped enslaved people to their so-called owners. So much for respecting states' rights. And let's be honest, if your ancestors fought for the Confederacy, that doesn't make you guilty of their sins. But it does make you responsible for telling the truth. And the truth is this. The Confederacy was built to uphold white supremacy. The Civil War was fought to defend slavery, and Southern pride was invented to whitewash that horror. So when you fly the Confederate flag or wear a t-shirt with Lee and Jackson on it, or call yourself a defender of heritage, you're not honoring your roots. You're preserving a justification for oppression. So no, it wasn't about states' rights. It was about enslaving people. And the myth that it was anything else, that myth is still being used today. It was to defend voter suppression, to erase black history, to attack civil rights movements, and to protect the same system and equality that were born in the Confederacy. When you wrap that lie in a flag and call it pride, you're not preserving history. You're protecting a lie. And that lie still hurts people right now and today.
Take the Department of Education, close it. I'm going to close it. We'll have one person, could be you if you decide to retire.
Okay, Mr. President, here's what bothers me. Here's what bothers me about that. So let's say you have a liberal city, let's Los Angeles, San Diego, and they just decide we're going to get rid of that history. We got new history. This is America built off the backs of slaves on stolen land. And that curriculum comes in.
Then we don't send them money. We would save half of our budget.
Okay.
And we're going to send. But if they want to do that,
because you do lose control when you go lower.
Well, we've lost control. We're number 40. We're last on the list. Okay. We're the worst there is, and we spend more money than.
So the last segment was about what the Confederacy what actually stood for. Now we're in this segment, it's about what happened after they lost. How they rewrote the story and turned traitors into heroes. Because here's the thing, the South didn't just lose the war, they lost the moral high ground. They were on the wrong side of history, and they knew it. So instead of owning that, they changed the narrative. They didn't retreat, they regrouped. Not on the battlefield, but in classrooms, cemeteries, town halls, and front porches. And that's where the quote-unquote lost cause myth was born. And let me be clear, the lost cause wasn't just some sad southern fantasy. It was a full-blown propaganda campaign. And it had two main engines driving it: the United Daughters of the Confederacy, UDC, and the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Their mission: to rewrite the Civil War as a noble fight for Southern honor, to make Confederate leaders look like martyrs, and most importantly, to erase slavery as the cause of the war. And they started in the most powerful place they could, the minds of children. So the UDC spent decades lobbying school boards across the South. They pushed for textbooks that twisted the truth into something unrecognizable. In a textbook from 1911, Elementary History of the United States, this is how they describe slavery. And I quote, "The mildest form of servitude in the world, where the N-word was the happiest laborer in the world." Think about it. Enslaved people ripped from their families, worked to death, whipped, raped, and described as happy workers. That's not just false. That's psychological warfare on students and on reality. And this wasn't some French book. It was used in schools for decades. In this UDC approved versions of history, the war wasn't about slavery. It was about a novel struggle for states' rights. Robert E. Lee wasn't a man who fought to preserve human bondage. He was painted as a kind-hearted gentleman. And the North wasn't the side that fought to preserve the Union. They were portrayed as the aggressors. Even Reconstruction, that brief window when Black Americans got a taste of political power and civil rights, It was framed as a dark time full of corruption and chaos. See how the trick works now? If the Confederacy wasn't evil, and if slavery wasn't that bad, then maybe, just maybe, white supremacy wasn't wrong either. Now let's talk about all those statues that all these Confederates love to talk about. Most people think Confederate monuments were built right after the war, and they weren't. The majority of them popped up between 1890 and 1920, right in the middle of Jim Crow. Shocking. In a time when black Americans were being lynched, blocked from voting, and pushed out of public life. And these statues weren't about remembering history. They were about reminding people who was still in charge. Think about it. If your black kid in 1915 walked past the statue of Robert E. Lee every day to go to your underfunded segregated school, that's not education, that's intimidation. And here's the kicker. After the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education decision, when the Supreme Court ruled that schools had to integrate, there was another spike in Confederate flags and symbols being thrown up. Mississippi added the Confederate battle flag to their state flag in 1956, a full 90 years after the war. Not to honor history, but to say, we don't like that black kids are going to school with our kids. And these weren't acts of memory. These were acts of protest against equality. So yeah, this isn't just dusty history. This is why so many people still believe the lie today. The Lost Cause gave white Americans a way to feel proud without feeling guilty. It gave them heroes to worship instead of crimes to reckon with. Even today you hear it. You hear stuff like this. Robert E. Lee was a brilliant general. My great-grandpa wasn't racist. He fought for his land. Why are you trying to erase history? Let's make this clear one more time. No one's erasing history. We're just done lying about it. Because if you build your identity on denial, if you build your patriotism on fairy tales, if you raise your children on myths that excuse violence, then you don't get democracy. You get delusion. And that delusion still lives on in state houses, in classrooms, in TikTok comment sections, and in campaign rallies. The Confederacy didn't win the war, but thanks to the Lost Cause myth, they've been winning the story ever since. But not here, not today. We're telling the truth, and we're not sorry about it.
From a bridge over Interstate 85 in the upstate this weekend, Spartanburg County deputies say a group of Confederate supporters and a Black Lives Matter group were on the Highway 101 overpass yesterday morning. Tim Arnold was among the Confederate supporters. He says that they are upset that Confederate monuments are being vandalized and torn down.
And we gathered here because we want them to know that they can be proud. It's okay to be proud to be Southern, to be proud of our heritage and where we come from. Okay, just like any other culture, we just want to be respected and allowed, and dare I even say tolerated.
Spartanburg County deputies, the Highway Patrol, and Greer Police were all there to keep the events peaceful. We're told that there were no arrests.
A deadly crash in Spartanburg.
So now you heard the phrase, or maybe you've seen it on a t-shirt or a pickup truck decal or a Facebook comment thread and so on and so on. It's not hate, it's heritage. Okay, but let's break that down. Whose heritage are we talking about? And who gets erased when you slap a Confederate flag on a bumper and call it pride? Because when you're looking at, what you're looking at isn't a cultural memory, it's cosplay. It's a costume party where people dress up as rebels and pretend it's patriotic. But the problem is that costume was soaked in blood, and the story behind it has been scrubbed clean by over a century of lies. Let's start with the symbol itself, the Confederate battle flag. It was never the official flag of the Confederacy, not once. It was one of several military banners mostly used by Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, but that didn't matter to the people who brought it back, because after the Civil War, it didn't stay in the museum where it should be. It came roaring back as a symbol of defiance, not against the Union, but against civil rights. In 1948, the Dixiecrat Party, a group of Southern segregationists who broke from the Democratic Party, made the Confederate flag their emblem. Their platform, opposing Truman's push to integrate the military and guarantee civil rights for Black Americans. So then in 1956, Georgia redesigned its state flag to include the battle cross. Why? To protest Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision that forced schools to desegregate. And they weren't subtle protests. They were political middle fingers to equality. And every time a southern state added that flag to their government buildings, they weren't saying, remember history. They were saying, remember who's in charge. Now let's talk culture, because the myth didn't stay in government. It crawled into music, TV, fashion, everywhere. You had the Dukes of Hazzard in the 70s and 80s, two good old boys riding around the General Lee, a bright orange car with a Confederate flag painted on the roof. Millions of Americans grew up thinking that flag was just a quirky Southern fun. But let me ask you something. Who was on the joke? Because for Black Americans, that flag doesn't mean moonshine and banjo solos. It meant lynching, cross burnings, and denial of basic human rights. It means that every courthouse, every cop car, every school building that fluid, it was a warning. You're not welcome here. But that myth kept going. Country artists like Hank Williams Jr., Kid Rock, and even early Leonard Skinner draped themselves in the flag and branded itself as a Southern grid. But what were they really selling? Was racial nostalgia, plain and simple. It wasn't about freedom. It was about feelings. The feeling of a better America when people knew their place. And in the 2000s, the internet supercharged it. Confederate flags became emojis, decals, and ironic t-shirts. The joke was always the same. Relax, it's just heritage. Or the other ones like, if this flag offends you, read a history book. But when symbols are used to suppress, threaten, and divide again and again, they don't get to hide behind jokes. Then it came January 6, 2021. Let's talk about what happened in the Capitol, where for the first time in American history, a Confederate flag was waved inside the building. Not during the Civil War, not when the South seceded, not even then did they reach the Capitol. But they made it in 2021, carried by Americans who claimed they were taking their country back. Some wore t-shirts that said, Camp Auschwitz, 6 million wasn't enough, Southern pride. You don't believe me? There's pictures everywhere you can find them. And they were Proud Boys with Confederate patches, Oath Keepers with Dixie flags on their gear, people chanting slogans rooted in the same fantasy the Lost Cause created. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the logical conclusion of decades of denial, revision, and whitewashing. The Confederate cosplay has come full circle, from schoolyard myth to domestic terrorism. So let's stop pretending. A flag doesn't become hate by accident. It becomes hate when it's used for hate, over and over and over. When people say it's not about slavery, but use it to fight civil rights, when people say it's not about racism, but they bring it on white supremacist rally, when people say it's just pride, but it flies next to a noose or a burning cross or a swastika, that's not coincidence. That's history repeating itself. And when someone wraps themselves in the flag and says about heritage, what they're really saying is, I like America before it was equal. They're not honoring their ancestors. They're role-playing a version of history where they were never the villain. That's not heritage, that's cosplay. And it's not harmless because every time we excuse the symbol, every time we give it a pass, every time we say, well, it means something different to me, we let the lie live one more day. So let's call it what it is. When you glamorize a failed rebellion built on slavery, you're not defending freedom. You're decorating the crime scene.
You could possibly pass.
What we've heard a lot of this week, which is folks who don't want the flag to change, saying we don't believe it stands for racism and it stands for, my family's heritage.
This stands for my heritage
Yeah,
bullshit.
So,
I mean, don't give me this crock bullshit that it's your fucking heritage. I mean, if you really want to get down to it, then your heritage was like hanging black people from trees. If your family's from Mississippi and has been here for the past 200 years, you have a finger in that. So why not get rid of it? I mean, also you lost. Yeah. You fucking lost. Yeah. It is illegal. It is illegal to fly a Nazi flag in Germany. The entire fucking country.
So if the Civil War was the Confederacy's military defeat, then education was their second chance at victory. Because rewriting history doesn't stop at flags and statutes. It's in our textbooks, it's in our laws, and in the mouths of politicians who act like teaching the truth is somehow an act of aggression. The Confederate lie, the lost cause, it didn't die. It got institutionalized. Ah, gosh, there's days I can't say words anymore, y'all. And it's in our school curriculum. Your kid's history book, your governor's press conference, your uncle's Facebook post. This isn't just a lie whisper at the dinner table. This is a lie funded, legislated, and normalized by people in power. So let's go back to the original topic, in thought police. In 1919, the United Daughters of Confederacy, you remember them, released a little guidebook called A Measuring Rod to Test Textbooks and Reference Books in Schools, College, and Libraries. It's a catchy title, right? Long. And to try to say that 10 times in a row without stopping. But here's what it actually said. And I quote, "Reject the book that says the South fought to hold slaves. Reject the book that speaks of the slaveholder of the South as cruel or unjust." This wasn't a suggestion. That was a demand. The UDC used it to pressure school boards, governors, and libraries across the South. And they won. Entire generation of kids, black and white, grew up learning that slavery was benevolent, the Civil War was about northern aggression, Reconstruction was a mistake, Confederate generals were saints in uniforms. And this wasn't French, this was a mainstream education, and it shaped public memory for decades. Let that sink in. Confederate apologists controlled the narrative in American classrooms for most of the 20th century. And now, they're doing it again. Daughters of Liberty. Just saying. Now let's fast forward to 2020 censorship. These days, we don't call it the Confederate curriculum. We call it anti-CRT legislation, or divisive concept bans, or patriotic education. Different name, same goal. Control what your children are allowed to learn. Let me break it down. In Texas, House Bill 3979 bans teaching that slavery was foundational to American history, even though, spoiler alert, it was. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis signed the Stop Woke Act. God, I hate this man. It bans lessons that might cause discomfort to white students, and as if discomfort is more dangerous than injustice. In Tennessee, teachers can be fined up to $1 million for lessons that undermine the unity of the country. Translation: don't teach that the Confederacy committed treason. Don't teach that racism exists. Don't teach the truth. This is not about protecting kids. This is about protecting power. It's about building a generation of Americans who don't question authority because they've never been told the truth about it. And now let's zoom out, because this isn't about schools. This is happening in state capitals too. You want proof? Again, Mississippi only removed the Confederate emblem from its state flag in 2020. That's 155 years after the war ended. And they only did it under national pressure during the George Floyd protest. Even then, some lawmakers tried to block it. In South Carolina, the Confederate flag flew at the state capitol until 2015. It wasn't removed after Dylan Roof, a white supremacist, murdered 9 black churchgoers in Charleston and posed with the flag in his manifesto. Even that wasn't enough to end the lie, because right now, in 2025, we're seeing all over again. States are banning AP African American studies. School districts are removing books by black authors. Governors are pushing patriotic education programs that paint slavery as a footnote and make white founding fathers into flawless superheroes. And some of them are going further. In Alabama, a state legislature proposing banning the term Civil War in public schools, saying it should be called War Between the States. Not because it's more accurate, but because it makes the sound less wrong. That's not education, that's propaganda, again and again. So let me ask you again, why does history matter? Because when you ban the truth, you don't just protect ignorance, you weaponize it. You build a society where people salute traitors, punish teachers, dismantle diversity programs, and walk around thinking that Southern pride is more American than the Constitution itself. And we're watching the Confederacy's second act, not in cannon fire, but in curriculum standards. They lost the war, but they won the memory. Because they understood something a lot of us didn't. If you control what people learn, you control what they believe. And if you control what they believe, you never have to fire a single shot to control who they become.
Many of those people were there to protest the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. So, this week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week? And is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You're changing history. You're changing culture. People were there protesting the taking down of the monument of Robert E. Lee. Everybody knows that. We have a very, very important heritage and history. And whether things are good or bad, you learn from it. I agree, there were Confederate soldiers, generals, but they were done after the war in order to heal. This was a gesture of healing.
When it comes to the Confederate flag, what is your stance personally on that in our society?
My stance is very simple. It's freedom of speech. You do what you do. It's freedom of speech.
Back in 2015, you said the Confederate battle flag belongs in a museum. Do you still believe that?
All I say is freedom of speech.
Would you be comfortable with your supporters displaying the Confederate battle flag at political events?
You know, it depends on what your definition is, but I am comfortable with freedom of speech. It's very simple.
But you understand why the flag is a painful symbol for many people because it's a reminder of slavery.
Well, people love it, and I know people that like the Confederate flag, and they're not thinking about slavery.
Is the Confederate flag offensive?
It depends on who you're talking about, when you're talking about. When people proudly had their Confederate flags, they're not talking about racism. They love their flag. It represents the South. They like the South. People right now like the South. I say it's freedom of many things, but it's freedom of speech.
So here's where I want to leave you in this part of the show. We pull apart the lies, we dug up the receipts, and we call out the myth of Southern pride for what it really is. A multi-generational cover-up, a custom party built on human suffering, a lie so big it's been written into law. The Confederacy wasn't misunderstood. It was not noble, it was not a different way of life. It was a violent rebellion formed for one reason, to keep black people enslaved. Its leaders weren't men of honor. They were men who committed treason against the United States, and they did it to defend a system of rape, torture, forced labor, and generational theft. And yet here we are, over 150 years later, still watching people call that history proud, still watching elected officials defend Confederate monuments, and still hearing people say, well, it's just heritage. So let me take off the podcast hat for a minute and speak to you as a veteran. I didn't put on the uniform to watch Americans wave the flag of the very people who tried to kill American soldiers. I didn't swear an oath to defend this country so politicians could pose the Confederate statues and rewrite the legacy of men who literally wanted to destroy the Constitution. Again, I've been saying I love this country, but loving a country doesn't mean lying for it. It means fighting for what it could be, not making excuses for what it's been. Because let's be real, you don't honor freedom by defending monuments to slavery. You don't celebrate patriotism by glorifying armed rebellion, and you sure as hell don't protect democracy by pretending men who wanted to break it apart were American heroes. Because let's look at what real example. Let's talk about a country that actually knows how to take responsibility. Germany. After World War II, Germany didn't put up statues of Hitler. They didn't name schools after Goebbels or Himmler. They didn't say, well, that's our culture, that's our heritage. No, they said, this was evil. This can never happen again. They turned concentration camps into memorials, not museums of pride. They made it illegal to fly the Nazi flag in public. They embedded Holocaust education into every level of schooling, not to shame German kids, but to make sure they never become the next generation of enablers. In Germany, students visit Auschwitz. They study the rise of fascism. They learn how propaganda works, how ordinary people were manipulated, and they were taught to see that national pride without accountability is a straight road to disaster. It's not about guilt, it's about growth. Meanwhile, here in America, we are here banning AP African American studies. We're passing laws that punish teachers for saying the word racism. We're removing books from libraries that dare to show slavery as brutal and not mutually beneficial. We got lawmakers who want to rename the Civil War something like the war between the states, as if that somehow makes it less racist, less violent, and less real. Let me make this plain. If Germany can teach their kids that their grandparents supported a genocidal regime, then we can teach our kids that Robert E. Lee was not a damn hero. It's like, who's benefiting from this? Let me ask you something. If you're still holding on to this idea of Southern pride, ask yourself, where did that story come from? Who taught it to you? Whose face was on the textbook? Whose statue was on the courthouse lawn? Because you weren't handed that story by accident. You were handed that story by people with a very clear agenda to erase the crimes, glorify the traitors, and keep a version of history that made them feel comfortable. Here's the uncomfortable truth. You don't have to carry your ancestors' sins, but you do have a responsibility to stop passing them down. You can break the chain. You can say, they were wrong. You can teach your children that real story, not the polished one. Patriotism isn't about how many flags you fly. It's not about how loud you sing the anthem. It's not about defending every mistake America has ever made. Real patriotism is about truth, about accountability, about having the courage to look at your country in the eye and say, we need to do better. Because if your definition of patriotism includes saluting traitors, justifying slavery, or rewriting history to protect your feelings, then you're not a patriot. You're just a fan of nostalgia, even when the nostalgia is built on someone else's suffering. So here's what I'll say to close. To the teachers still telling the truth, thank you. To the students who ask the hard questions, don't stop. To the parents who want their kids to know everything, not just the pretty parts, you are doing it right. And to anyone out there who feels alone, tired of watching this country decorate the lie and ignore the wound, I'll say this. You're not alone. There are millions of us who want better, who believe that truth matters, who are ready to stop pretending that monuments make us moral or that heritage excuses harm. Because we deserve a country that doesn't just honor the past, we deserve one that learns from it. And if the truth makes some people uncomfortable, good. That's what history is supposed to do. So, to end this whole episode, I had to do this episode. Not because it was easy, but because I'm tired. Tired of watching politicians rewrite history like it's a campaign slogan. Tired of seeing Confederate traitors get polished into heroes while teachers get demonized for telling the truth. And especially tired of people like Ryan Walters, right here in Oklahoma, forcing white supremacy into our classrooms and calling it patriotic education, which is hilarious that he wants to call Oklahoma Southern pride. Oklahoma was not even part of the Civil War. We were not even a thought. Anyways, let me say this clear as I can. It's not patriotic to lie to children, it's not freedom to erase slavery from the American story, and it's sure as hell's not Southern pride to celebrate men who waged war against the United States to keep black people in chains. This isn't about canceling history, it's about correcting it, because when we let the lie live, we let injustice breathe. And I watched Donald Trump stand at Fort Bragg, a face once named after one of the most incompetent, bigoted Confederate generals in American history, which is hilarious because he is one of the most incompetent, bigoted presidents in American history. And he stood there praising those men, selling merchandise branded with their legacy, and using the military like props in his political theater. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't just sit in silence. I had to say something, and this episode is that something. It's the line in the sand. It's a reminder that truth still matters, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. So if you care about the truth, if you're tired of the gaslighting, the censorship, the Confederate cosplay being sold as patriotism, and if you believe in the version of this country that faces its past instead of hiding from it, then stick with me, please. Because this is just the beginning, and we got more to uncover, more to expose, and I'm not staying quiet. Not now, not never. So this has been The Problem With, and this has been The Lies We Tell. Please follow me on Spotify, give me a comment, a rating, or follow me on YouTube. And please, if I will appreciate any type of engagement. And if you want to share this with anybody, please do. Because this will help us to spread the truth, and we need to do that. So again, thank you for everybody. Thank you for your help. And keep listening and fighting for the truth.
No doubt.